The National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers issued a report called Benchmarking for Success. And in this report, they called for a new vision for the historic state-federal partnership in education, one in which the federal government could assist states in specific ways at each stage of the journey, including by incentivizing the states to, as soon as possible, offer new funding to help upgrade state standards by adopting a common core of internationally benchmarked standards in math and language arts for grades K to 12, and to help ensure that assessments are aligned to the standards. It's an issue going forward. So you have this structure. The Common Core are owned by the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State School Officers. The idea is to have standards that are common across all the states. You know, you have to implement the standards 100%. You can add 15%. You're not supposed to change any of the standards. It's a tremendous governance question going forward. The states have given up a tremendous amount of autonomy in participating in this system. Instead of state-led, we had these private entities with no accountability to the states, to the people, asking the federal government to intercede in the business of the states.
Now, critics, like those of us that are gathered here of national tests, maintain that what is tested is going to be what is taught, and that the combination of national tests, national standards, the race to the top grants, and the No Child Left Behind waivers that the national government is putting out put America on the road to a national curriculum.
For what purpose do we educate our children? And the progressives, to their credit, have a very clear answer. With the best in intentions, and perhaps also working with the conceit that they know best, they made clear that the purpose of education is first and foremost to training a workforce, for workforce development. Both the efficient and high-minded goals that they espouse lose their luster. Higher standards, as we've seen, actually mean demonstrably lower standards in states such as Indiana. And governments left to train their citizens, in practice, are more likely to train subjects than citizens. But philosophically, their vision also fails. The fundamental problem with all of these progressive goals is they put institutions ahead of people. If we truly want to put children first, we must empower the people who see the child as a person, right? A person created in the image and likeness of God, and that person is their parents.
In our modern push to standardize and make uniform and to equalize, we necessarily must end up discarding any higher aspiration of education's end in an embrace of what can only be widely secured agreements about lower and debased ends, an education based upon the lowest common denominator. That's the only way we can agree on what it should look like. Our civilization thus shows its ultimate commitments through how it educates its young, that we think them incapable of anything higher than being workers in a deracinated, globalized economic system, but that they are not citizens or men or women.
Now, in ELA, the two lead standards writers were David Coleman and Susan Pimentel, neither of whom had experience teaching English either in K-12 or at the college level. Neither of them had ever published serious work on K-12 curriculum and instruction. Neither had a reputation for scholarship and research. They were virtually unknown in the field of English language arts, and English teachers at the high school level really resent this to this day. But they had been chosen to transform ELA education in the U.S. Who recommended them and why, we still do not know. Eventually, by July 2009, CCSSI revealed the names of the 24 members of what was called the Standards Development Work Group, which was designated as developing these two sets of standards. What did the ELA work group look like? Its makeup was quite astonishing. It included no English professors or high school English teachers. This was the group developing college and career readiness standards for English language arts. How could you have legitimate standards without the two groups of educators who know the most about what students should and could be learning in secondary English and reading classes? This is the first clue that there was something very wrong about this project. CCSSI also released in July the names of individuals in a larger feedback group, much larger. This group included one English professor and one high school English teacher. By that time, it had sunk in that there was something wrong with who was talking about English language arts. Because both work groups, the one for math and the one for ELA, worked in secret without open meetings, sunshine law minutes of meetings, or accessible public comment, we have no idea to this day why they made the decisions they did, if they made any decisions, and what the standards writers did with them. As a condition of membership, all the members had to agree to 10 conditions. This was pretty soon after we met in September, among which were the following, and I'm not going to quote all of them. The only two important ones at this point are ownership of all the Common Core state standards resides exclusively with CCSSO and the NGA. We were told that right from the outset. It didn't occur to me how important this was at the time. This one must have just slipped by me because I never thought about how you could have public standards if they were owned by an outside group that was private. The other one was the one that I used to talk about often with Jim. It says, I agree to maintain the deliberations, discussions, and work of the validation committee, including the content of any draft or final documents that such a committee might produce, on a strictly confidential basis. Now, I had been on many town committees and on a state board of education, as well as in a state department of education. This was not a civic procedure for the development of state standards.
But we're the only ones in mathematics, in the mathematics group on validation, who voted against it, because both of us understood very well that what was going on there was, if anything, anti-mathematical. What does Common Core do? Well, Common Core defines college readiness as past Algebra 2. Well, that is a very weak standard. That is a very weak standard. The next course over, trigonometry, the course over, pre-calculus, if a student intending to go into a STEM area enters the college world either through the community colleges or through the regular public universities or the private ones, enters with a preparation where the highest math course they took was Algebra 2, then they're going to have to take a remedial course, trigonometry or pre-calculus, before they can do anything else, and something like 2.1% of such STEM-intending students ever manage to get a degree in a STEM area, 2.1%. So if you're focused on STEM, then this thing says zero output. That's the root of the current concern for me, is that with this going on, the colleges are going to be forced to lower their entry standards and indeed their first and second year courses. And that's going to be a disaster for the country.
Michael Kirst, professor emeritus at Stanford, he was chairing the NAEP governing board to figure out if you can have the same standards really reflect both college readiness and career readiness. And he said, to my knowledge, no, and certainly the writers of the standard didn't present any evidence. Well, they declared it by fiat, that they are one and the same. There is no evidence behind it. And the evidence we saw today shows that they are below academic expectations. So maybe they are career ready, they are certainly not college ready.
It's not apparent that the individual standards were tied to any research. I mean, normally when you see something this important, you see these citations after it and have little people's names and dates, and that's because they're based on research. So surely you'd think that the academic standards for a nation of children would be based on research. We don't want them to be little guinea pigs in experiments, or mice in psychology are the experiments, and we're going to just see how this goes, and hopefully it'll all work out. Saw this college and career readiness goal, and then they backed those standards down all the way to kindergarten. So instead of thinking about what's developmentally appropriate for a kindergartner, they're thinking, this is where we want that kindergartner to wind up. Let's track this all back down to kindergarten and have them work on those skills in a kindergarten way. There's some major flaws with that. You can train a second grader to answer abstract questions, but you have not really changed the internal process of understanding abstraction. You have trained them to answer questions. But you see this all throughout the standards. They'll talk about fewer, deeper, not a mile wide and an inch deep. They're always deeper standards, fewer and deeper. And really, when I look at them, often they're requiring these children, 8, 7, 9, who are right in the midst of this concrete operational period. Remember, they like concrete operations, no abstractions. And they're requiring them to explain, justify, and apply principles that are abstract in nature. And this is repeated throughout the math standards. It's no longer good enough to know that 7 minus 3 equals 4. You have to explain and justify how you came up with that answer.
For the Common Core test that came out of New York this spring, for example, they penalized children for getting the right answer with the wrong method. So if we're talking about Common Core having, supposed to be, you have freedom within the classroom, you can get to the goals of Common Core whatever way you want, but that test comes in with the ratchet and says, oh, but if you didn't teach this method, look, all your kids are going to score, they can't get the multiplication problem right, even though they know how to multiply. They can change the test to push the sort of teaching that they want to be occurring in schools. So even teachers who in the past, you've heard this probably if you talk to a teacher, oh, I've just closed, I close my door and I ignore them, it's another fad, I've seen 5 of them in the past 20 years. Well, if the fad is following you around in your classroom with the clipboard, you can't shut the door. President Obama's education team just announced that they're going to hand out to states their last extension of No Child Left Behind. So that means that was another way by which Common Core entered the states. And to get this waiver of No Child Left Behind, states have to commit once more to Common Core. But not only this, they have to commit to using the results from teacher evaluations to redistribute the good teachers across school districts in the state. I'm not kidding. Literally, if you're a principal and you identify certain teachers as good, you have to present the federal government with the plan of how you will make sure that no school district has more percentages of the rated good teachers than other school districts.
This is what Arne Duncan said about data. He said, hopefully someday we can track children from preschool to high school and from high school to college and college to career. We want to see more states build comprehensive systems that track students from pre-K through college and then link school data to workforce data. We want to know whether Johnny participated in an early learning program and then completed college on time, and whether those things had any bearing on his earnings as an adult. Now, if we're going to know all that about Johnny, we have to know everything there is to know about Johnny, from his birth through his career. According to the National Education Data Model, we're really talking about over 400 data points on each child. Now, that's not mandated, that's recommended, but we're going in that direction. Over 400 data points, and this would include things such as healthcare history, family income range, disciplinary history, voting status, religious affiliation. And once they get it, then they want to share it and can share it under the new FERPA regulations with literally anyone in the world, as long as they use the correct enabling language. It can go to the Department of Labor, to the Department of Health and Human Services, to, I don't know, IRS.
I've had recently some Common Core proponents, when looking at the evidence presented by Dr. Milgram and Dr. Werman, they say, well, okay, well, but what's the harm? We needed to try something. And, you know, it may be easy for them to say, what's the harm? But to me, with a parent, you know, as the parent of children in school, and for all the other parents who happen to have children in school today, it's not so easy. Because our children get only one shot at a good education. And when this fails, which it will, those who sit in positions of power and authority, who have the ability to stop it right now and choose not to, they'll be able to walk away. And some of them will walk away with their pockets lined. But our children can't walk away. They will be forever impacted by the education policy decisions being made by such people today. Let's hope and pray that they do the right thing.
I decided to look on my own to get a better understanding of what drove Common Core. I mean, what is it that they point to that says these are the reasons we are making these decisions and changes? So needless to say, I was shocked. Shocked that a majority of credible people from education establishments all across this country were so steadfast in their supportive standards that had absolutely little to no research to justify its claims. In fact, it seemed as if the research pointed in the opposite direction of the path the Common Core was taking, and reliable data and research was being ignored.
From K to 12, over 50% of reading instructional time must be devoted in the reading or English class to something called informational texts. Many state departments of education, if not school districts, have told their English teachers that they may probably only have time for one long novel, or they may have only time for excerpts. And the one English teacher I knew who was teaching the Odyssey was told that indeed all they would have time for would be excerpts from the Odyssey because there was too much informational text that they needed to cover at the same time.
So what do we find of the presentation of the U.S. Constitution in the Common Core itself? And now I'm looking at the core documents exclusively. In the middle school age band, the students are required to read the First Amendment and also the preamble. They're not required to read the Second Amendment, of course not, or the Third Amendment, or the 10th Amendment, which is not in there. Apparently, the young critical thinkers we are told the Common Core will be making are not ready for the Constitution by the 8th grade, even though the core knowledge sequence, which is a well-known K-8 curriculum used by a lot of charter schools and a few district public schools, has students read the entire U.S. Constitution in the 8th grade. More surprisingly, students are not required to read the whole Constitution in the 11th or the 12th grades, only the Bill of Rights. Now, we could be charitable and say that the students will be reading the Constitution in government or history. If so, then why are we given the Bill of Rights in English and a book on the Constitution in the History Social Studies section of the Appendix B, but not the Constitution itself? Well, the brief selection taken from that book is more alarming, and this is a modern book that was written. The selection does not explain federalism, checks and balances, or the separation of powers, the rule of law, or the authority of we the people, things that we would expect to find in an introduction to the Constitution. Rather, the selection, having been so heavily edited that it does not even make complete sense, is riddled with incendiary language such as vicious, masterclass, and ugly. What I derive from this is that we cannot count on students to read the whole Constitution themselves. We cannot introduce a complex informational text such as Madison's classic Federalist Numbers 10 or 51. But we can use incendiary language pulled from a recently written book to create in our students a distaste for the Constitution they haven't read. If that's not programming, I don't know what it is. And if you don't believe me, turn to page 176 of Appendix B in the Common Core English Standards.
But I think for the purposes of a discussion about school choice, it's also important to realize that the major drivers behind Common Core, the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the U.S. Department of Education, the American Federation for Teachers, the National Education Association, the PTA, the Gates Foundation, in Achieving, on top of having, over the last 25 years, a very poor record on academic standards and improving student achievement, frankly, anywhere, none of those folks are advocates of school choice. In fact, many of them have an outright hostility to school choice. So the problem with states adopting a voucher program that has the state test connected to it and pulls the kids then into the Common Core through the standards and the test is they're actually playing right into the hands of the people who for decades have despised school choice.
The goal is to include the data of all students, homeschool, private school, and of course public school students, in these statewide longitudinal data systems. How will this data be protected? What will be included in it? It's frankly Orwellian and very, very concerning, I think, to every parent.